Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. Gary Nesner retired from the FBI in 2003, following a career of 30 years as an investigator, instructor, and negotiator. A significant focus of his career was directed toward investigating Middle East hijackings in which American citizens were victimized. In addition, he was an FBI hostage negotiator for 23 years of his career, retiring as the chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit, Critical Incident Response Group, and he was the first person to hold that position. In that capacity, he was heavily involved in numerous crisis incidents covering prison riots, right-wing militia standoffs, religious zealot sieges, terrorist embassy takeovers, airplane hijackings, and over 120 overseas kidnapping cases involving American citizens. He wrote a book about his FBI negotiation career, which was published in 2010, entitled Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. That book was used in part as the basis for a 6-part miniseries on Waco, where Gary was played by Michael Shannon. I want to give a personal shout out to Jeremy Hurwitz, who I had on my last episode, who wrote the book Sell Like a Spy. He is the one who really inspired me to get connected with Gary. So I just want to give a shout out again to Jeremy and his book, and definitely encourage you to listen to the last episode. But let's get to my conversation with Gary Nesner.
Well, I had a 30-year career in the FBI, and 23 years of that, in addition to my prior investigative experience, I became a negotiator, and that was a part-time function for years. It became a full-time function for me the last 13 years of my career, and I became the chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit, and that's the first person to hold that position. We had negotiations before me, but when it rose up to the level of requiring a standalone unit. And in that capacity, we provide instruction to FBI and police. We conducted operational responses and we did research. So it was a pretty interesting mix of responsibilities. And through that process, I've worked over 120 kidnappings of American citizens. I've been to embassy sieges, prison riots, right-wing militia standoffs, Waco, on and on and on. And through those experiences, I gleaned, we gleaned collectively in the FBI, and I personally, we gleaned a lot of lessons about interpersonal communications and influence, and walking away with the belief that if the skill sets we learned are successful in dealing with people in very desperate situations, then certainly they have applicability to more normal life events in business and personal lives that are, less violence prone. So, I mean, that's the basic premise. And becoming a good listener and earning the right to be of influence by being genuine and respectful. That's kind of the basic lessons. And in a lot of ways, it's simple. In a lot of ways, people still don't do it. So, I find there's no end of audiences receptive to hearing a little bit more about how we came to these conclusions and, how we dealt with some of these high profile situations in the past.
And I know you were integral in helping develop the FBI's negotiation department, or whatever you would like to call it. And can you share a little bit about even just, I guess, the genesis of that and
Sure.
NYPD and just that
Yeah,
evolution?
because of thinking about the Attica prison situation and the Munich massacre, which occurred prior, the New York City Police Department said we need to come up with a better way. They'd also had a major incident that didn't go so well in terms of how it was managed. So they came up with an emergency response team, which was a tactical team, and then they said, well, we need a negotiation component. And the FBI recognized it as being a really good concept and a good idea. So we embraced it, and obviously expanded the philosophical underpinnings of it, and the lessons learned because we taught nationwide and not only spread out the word, but learned lessons from police departments who began to use this, and we spread it worldwide. And for the first, 10 or more years, 15, 16 years of the program, it was mostly about bargaining. That was the New York model that the FBI embraced, and on the concept that a hostage taker uh, is engaged in something, in order to get its demands met. If you don't give me what I want, I'm going to kill Derek, and therefore putting pressure on the authorities to comply. Well, in those situations, it was quid pro quo bargaining. Okay, well, I hear what you're saying, but you're in that bank with these hostages and you're asking for some food, but I can't get to that food unless you help me to help you let one of these hostages go. So it's sort of a trade back and forth, and the basic model was you don't give anything without getting something in return, and it served law enforcement quite well because prior to that we would just go in guns a blazing and let God sort out who made it, who didn't. Um, and that had some pretty tragic results, losing police officers, hostages being killed by the bad guy or the police. So we really embraced negotiations as a way to keep police officers safe. But the big change I saw when I became a full time negotiator in 1990 was what most police were doing. In fact, in the 90 percentile of what law enforcement were doing, not just in the United States, but worldwide, were not really bargaining interactions. They were crisis intervention. Suicidal people, escalated domestic situations, workplace violence, neighbor disputes, and police are responding. A lot of times, alcohol, drugs are involved. And in those cases, you don't show up and say, "Hey, let your wife go, and I'll give you a hamburger." I mean, it doesn't work that way. So we had to embrace and adopt, and this is one area where I feel proud to have spearheaded this. We borrowed from the mental health field in the work of psychotherapist Carl Rogers and embraced active listening skills, which enabled us to listen thoughtfully, respond effectively, and develop a projection of genuineness and sincerity, something they didn't expect from the police, and allowed us to create a relationship of trust that now allowed us to influence the behavior of the perpetrator. And it's been enormously successful. Back in the early 90s, you could go to a law enforcement negotiation conference and say, "How many of you are conversant in active listening skills?" And you'd be lucky if you saw one or two hands, probably none. And now everybody, it's the bread and butter of the business. It's had that kind of an impact because it works so effectively, not just in crisis situations, but even in hostage situations. So, we try to de escalate, open up a channel of communication, listen to what's motivating the other person, try to demonstrate that we're not there to make their life worse, that, we're not going to just say yes to everything they want. But on the other hand, we're open to hearing what they have to say and acknowledging that. And believe it or not, that is a powerful tool in human communication in order to affect people's behavior. And they come to see that police negotiator on the other end of the phone as somebody that they can believe in when they're told that they're not going to get beat up when they surrender or they're not going to be shot when they come out the back door, whatever it might be. So it's a really powerful thing, and it's really literally impossible to calculate, Derek, how many lives have been saved as police have embraced this, not just nationally but worldwide. Because we never hear about the cases that don't turn tragic, but we know it's tens of thousands of lives have been saved because of this. So it's good stuff.
One of the things, the more and more, and we're going to talk a couple different times here about your book, Stalling for Time. But as a therapist, one of the things I loved in it was de-escalation. It's really what it is. People feel the walls closing in. They get tunnel vision. They really start to feel like it's binary. There's not many options, and it almost seems like you're as much a therapist as anything of like, hey, we got to broaden this and show that there are options, and time helps us get there.
Yeah, it's exactly right, and that's part of the reason I named my book "Stalling for Time" because back when I first got my negotiation training, in the early days, the first three words on my note taking guide were "stall for time," and it's the basic premise that if you do nothing else, you slow things down to allow emotions to subside. It serves to help de-escalate the tension, which then creates an opening for a relationship to take root and to try to grow to where you can gain influence. After a negotiator's been effective at doing this for a while, you'll typically hear something from the perpetrator. They'll say something like, Derek, I just don't know how to get out of this. Well, when I hear something like that, that's wow. Okay, now they're soliciting your input. You can say, well, I do know that hurting people isn't going to make it any better, you know, I think this is a good time for you to think about coming and put your weapon down, let those people out, come on out, so forth. And if you do that in a tone and a demeanor that doesn't come across as an official police voice, sir, you need to put your gun down and come on out. I mean, that's just, police are kind of trained to do that. It's like a military voice, but in these situations, it's less effective. And in fact, we probably find that the most effective negotiators are kind of the seasoned salts, the old detectives who know how to talk to people, know how to get witnesses to share information, to get perpetrators to give confessions, to are very good with helping victims and so forth. And that same set of skills in projecting warmth and sincerity and genuineness, and it can be firm too. It doesn't always have to be. You're not always acquiescing, but I think those skill sets are really the attributes of a really good and effective negotiator, like they probably are with a good therapist.
In your experience, were ultimatums ever necessary or ever beneficial?
I don't think so. I think, in fact, we have there's not a lot of absolute no-nos in the business, but one of them that's persisted through time is we don't put a deadline on ourselves or anybody else. When you put that kind of deadline on a perpetrator, you may likely get the result that you don't want. So and we avoid having a deadline put on us. Get me that car in 15 minutes. Well, we'll talk them through that and come up with reasons why that's a challenge or difficult or impossible or why we can't do it. But we try to avoid um, putting those kind of, and we don't bring it back up later on. Earlier today you demanded that car in 15 minutes. Do you still want that? I mean, we would never do that. Um, but yeah, so it's trying to perpetuate a conversation so that um, a connection can be built. And the whole idea of the connection, it needs to be sincere and genuine, not phony. But we really want to help this person. And I can tell you, even the most despicable criminals, I would prefer to see them come out and not harmed and let the people they hold out. That's a genuine desire and an easy thing for a negotiator to project. I mean, we're not making that up. Say, I really hate to see you get hurt. But so much you can hear a little bit maybe in my tone. The way we talk to the person is so important. There's a certain, whether from watching TV or their own street experience, there's a certain expectation that the police will be very official, very demanding, very inflexible. And yet, Officer so and so comes along and says, "Hey, Derek, how you doing in there, man? Sounds like you're having a tough day." It's not what they expect, and it's a little disarming in a positive way for us. And it helps get the proverbial salesman's foot in the door to create more of a relationship. And I guess I suppose there's some people that try to do it from purposeful manipulation, but I think to really be effective or the most effective, it certainly needs to be sincere and genuine. And so those are qualities not maybe every police officer has, but the negotiators typically do.
I wanna talk about a couple, cases that you worked and a couple learnings I think that, translate even beyond, into business, into life, into parenting, and honestly, Stalling for Time it's as much a parenting book. I've got young kids, and I trying to rationalize with my four-year-old, I'm like, "You know what? Like, let's talk about de-escalation, get my own emotions back here," I'm trying to talk to somebody whose prefrontal cortex is not firing at all. But the Talladega prison riots, how do you build trust when negotiating with a group rather than an
Well,
individual?
it's really tough. And you mentioned the Talladega prison riot. This was Cuban inmates, part of the Mariel boat list. These guys came over. Castro emptied out his prisons. They committed crimes here. They were tried, convicted, thrown in jail, and he wouldn't take them back. So they were stuck in limbo. That we couldn't deport them. So they stuck in federal prison, even though they'd serve their sentences. And this led to the Atlanta and Oakdale prison riots in the 80s that were resolved through negotiations. But the government at that point in time said, we're going to fix this problem. We're going to take care of it. But we never did. So Talladega pops up, and the same long term incarcerated Cuban inmates took hostages. So now we have to come in and deal with them in a situation where they're saying, "Well, you lied to us before," and we're still stuck in here with no resolution in sight. So it was a really tough nut to crack. It's not like we hadn't had prior experience. So it took a lot of delicacy, and ultimately, in that case, as you may recall with Talladega, we ended up having to do a tactical assault because of that faith having been lost because of prior situations. Fortunately, it ended well. No one was hurt. The hostage takers were recaptured, and the hostages safely released, and no shots fired. And that was a great event. But those are really really tough situations. But with a group, what we tried to do, and we did this in the Lucasville prison in Ohio, which is also talked about in my book that I responded to and helped the local authorities with. In that instance, there were 3 different factions within the facility holding hostages, and they all wanted different things, and each group had a number of people that wanted to talk to us about whatever was on their mind at that moment. You can imagine the chaotic situation that entailed. So we had to really help them get organized. To go to your question, I'm getting there eventually, that we had to kind of promote the reasonable people by rewarding their behavior with making some minor concessions, and doing the opposite for the people who were very threatening. And through that process, we sort of bolstered, in the eyes of the followers, the more moderate, reasonable people. These are people that can get things done for you. The other people can't. So you need to support this guy. So ultimately, with emotion subsiding after several days, we were able to get them organized enough. So you got to decide what it is your group wants. You've got to appoint a spokesperson, or a leader, and we can sit down and we can talk about these things. We can't talk to 10 people every time we call in and hear a wide range of different things that you want. So we had to help them to get organized. It might be a surprise to people, but inmates in prison aren't necessarily big proponents of organized democratic processes. So we had to kind of teach them on the fly. So that's how you do it. I mean, you can't really negotiate a riot or with a wide range of multiple individuals acting in different ways. You have to really sort of try to pinpoint who can really represent the other side, and that's who you have to deal with. The same thing would apply if you're dealing with 2 people and one of them's very unreasonable, one's reasonable. Well, you know which way you're going to steer your conversation, and where you will work the hardest to create a lasting relationship.
Well, and you get a situation that had to be, tactically dealt with and kinda following the timeline. You go into Waco. Do you feel like the Talladega approach influenced Waco or not with.
Yeah, and I talk about that in my book. I think when we had the Talladega prison riot, we because we got a hostage out through negotiations who told us, they're drawing names from they put the names in a bowl or whatever, and they're pulling out names who they're going to kill first. And she provided us with some additional information that really raised our concern at a very, very high level that failure to act would result in somebody being killed. So it compelled us. It's not a negotiation failure. It's just the inmates were pre-inclined not to make concessions this time. So a decision was made that we're going to make an entry. So as negotiators, we tried to make them a softer target by finally sending in food and having them put their guard down. That did in a small way help facilitate the tactical entry. The head of the FBI's hostage rescue team at the time came out of that incident because of the no shots fired, really well executed plan to recover the hostages and secure the inmates. Um, his stock was very, very high, and people at headquarters sort of said, "Well, this is the guy," and he was one rank above me. So we get out to Waco, and it would be my sense, that he had an outside influence on the thinking of the ultimate decision maker, the on-scene commander. And he became very frustrated, he, the tactical commander, with how long Waco was taking and how slow the progress was. And I certainly understood that frustration. But in that frustration, he sort of engaged in a bunch of counterproductive tactical activities that really served to send mixed signals and a contrary message to what the negotiators were saying and a counterproductive one. So eventually, I was replaced halfway through. We'd gotten 35 people out, including 20, 21 children. And they decided to adopt his more strident approach. And no one else came out for the rest of the ordeal. And, the FBI put in tear gas, the Davidians started the fire, and the rest is history, a tragic, tragic event in any way you shape or form. But yeah, I think there is a danger in not fulfilling the balanced approach that the FBI always taught. Waco was not so much that we didn't know how to deal with this religious fanatic, and he was a very challenging character, David Koresh. However, we really departed from our long-standing crisis management approach, and that is basically we use no more force than is absolutely necessary. We don't use force because we can, we're able to, we might prefer to punish this person. That's not how it works. We use force only when the behavior of the perpetrator leaves us no other options. That's the only thing that we can defend in a court of law or court of public opinion, which was the case in Talladega. We have very strong intelligence that they're going to start hurting people. We have an opportunity to intervene and we're going to do it. That was not the case in Waco at all. But, the fact that we have muscle and can use it doesn't mean we should. And if we use it prematurely, we're going to be subjected to, legal scrutiny and publicity. And, it damaged the FBI's reputation to this day. And I joined the FBI, in 1972 as a young guy, and we always had the FBI up on a high pedestal back then. And once you lose, the organization depends on the support of the American people, and if we lose that support, if we're deemed as not being able to do complex things, um, then we lose that credibility and support that's necessary for us to serve the American people. So yeah, I mean, it was a tragic event. Fortunately, after Waco, to not to take up too much time on this question, but 3 years later, we had the Montana Freeman siege, and now we had a new director and Louis Free, and Louis says to me, "Gary, I'm in no rush for this to end. I want this done the right way." And that was a real validation of a return to our longstanding philosophy of using no more force than necessary. We engaged in some very clever psychological maneuvers at the end to finally bring them to the table and secure a peaceful outcome, which was not only in our interest, but certainly the interest of the guys we arrested.
With that one lasted 81
Yeah, I
days,
think
is that
80,
right?
80, 81, 85.
Eighty,
Yeah,
80
a
plus?
long
Yeah.
time, a long
Yeah,
time.
if there was ever a case to test it on, and the way that ended.
Yeah, I think that's my first siege where we experienced all 4 seasons in in one siege.
Well, what was your first impression of David Koresh? I'll start there.
Obviously, a ceasefire had been, established before I flew out that night. It began on, what was it, April 19th of '93, shootout, and I was immediately contacted and flew out, and arrived there that evening, and, a ceasefire had already been obtained, and I ended up talking to Koresh. At this point in time, I'm running all the negotiations, so it's not necessarily my job to be the guy on the phone anymore. However, being the first one there, I got on the phone with him and negotiated with him through the night. And he was angry at ATF. He was wounded, so he was feeling some significant discomfort. He'd been shot in the side, and part of his hand was wounded from that same bullet that went through his side and came out over his thumb. Um, but I thought I was encouraged. We'd had a ceasefire. It had been quite a few hours since any additional shots had been fired. And I said, this guy's, obviously into himself, in his cult leadership. But I said, I kind of felt optimistic. This is somebody we could work with. So I went into that, feeling encouraged. Um, and then later on, it became complicated fairly early. David Koresh had promised to. We played a nationwide broadcast for an hour. He would surrender, and we did it. He backed away from that and changed his mind. Told him God told him to wait. And while that disappointed negotiators, we are hardly surprised by somebody not doing what they say. I mean, that's kind of what you deal with. But the tactical commander, the one mentioned earlier, and the on-scene commander both took it very personally and ratcheted up the external pressure, which only made our jobs more difficult. As a negotiator, and you would know this from psychology, if somebody backs off of a promise, you kind of keep bringing it up, say, Derek, you said this was really important to you, and I did it. I stuck my neck out and I convinced my boss that we should do this, and you didn't do it. I mean, that really puts me in a bad situation. I'm trying to help you here, man, but you have to help me. That's the approach we would have taken. And it's a quid pro quo kind of, deal that you say, hey, it's like the Moonies with the flowers at the airport. I give you a flower, you're supposed to pay him some money. Well, I did the broadcast, now where's my reward? But then when the tactical side in disproportional frustration in response to that began to roll forward and crush cars and do stuff with tanks, now it gave Koresh an excuse to say, you people can't be trusted, you don't control the tactical people, and it really was an impediment for several days in the negotiations. It took us to get back on track. But that's why we always say, all sides, tactical negotiations, everything has to speak in the same voice, be on the same sheet of music. That's sort of crisis management basics 101. But somehow it wasn't the case here, and that hurt us deeply.
I do want to give a plug to it's still on Netflix, The American Apocalypse.
Yeah, there's been in the recent years. There's been a two-part dramatic series by first on Paramount and then Showtime, and that's the one where actor Michael Shannon played me. That's a six-part dramatic series based in part on my book, and I thought they did a pretty good job. Although they, in my judgment, portrayed Koresh far too sympathetically. And then they did a sequel a couple years later, which again he plays me, but the role I did there was pretty much fictionalized. But in between, Netflix did a three-part documentary, which, if people are really serious about Waco and they want to know what happened, there's been a lot of documentaries, but that's the one. Yes, American Apocalypse. It's a great, and I had discovered for that some old video I had that was previously unknown of the negotiation team negotiating, which is pretty unheard of in any situation, much less that. So they used a bit of that in the documentary. It's darn good. And again, I was shown at the time, and then again interviewed for the documentary, and worked with the producers on that. It's a good show.
With the miniseries with Michael Shannon, like, just for the audience, it was they used your book, but then also,
David
the
Thibodeau.
person from inside, David Thibodeau, thank you, from his perspective, and so a bit of a conflict there in perspectives, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I like the concept at first. The Dowdle brothers, John and Drew, were the producer directors, and great, great guys, and remained friends with them. They had been in touch with David Thibodeau, one of the survivors of the Davidians, for probably a year before they had met me. So I think they embraced a lot of his perspective about what happened from inside. Although interestingly enough, Thibodeau wasn't part of the Davidian management team, if you could even say they had one. The management team was basically David Koresh. But Thibodeau's book obviously paints a darker look at the government and its sinister motives. My book, I believe, um, you know, showed the good things that we did, but it also showed the mistakes that the FBI made. I was pretty candid about that, and I think they reflected that in the dramatic series quite well. I don't think they adequately address Koresh's, sexual predation, his.
Maniacal,
Thank
yeah.
you, thank you. Got to go back to school, learn my English. His complete and all-encompassing control over his followers. I mean, they really did believe he spoke with God and did whatever he said. And I don't, I don't think that. the sinister nature of his character was accurately portrayed. Now, they kept telling me as I was watching the filming, "Well, it's gonna get worse, it's gonna get worse," and it never really did, and they know I criticize them, and I said, I love the film, but that was just, I think, a shortcoming that they had, and I think that was based on them working with Thibodeau's book first. But and David and I got along fine we were on set together, and everybody was waiting us to have a fist fight or something like that. But I like him. We got along fine, and we have different perspectives about what happened. But I think we developed a bit of a friendship there. That I mean, I could call him on the phone today and chat with him, and likewise. So, but that's the way it is.
One of the quotes, and I might be paraphrasing it so you can correct it, but it's the "Don't confuse getting even with what you want."
Yeah, I mean, what basically it's a little catchy way to say control your own emotions. Somebody may really press your buttons, irritate you, make you angry, and your initial response is to get defensive or counterattacked is maybe a better way of putting it. But then you have to stop and think, is this really furthering my objectives? Is this helping me accomplish what I want? I start a chapter, each chapter of my book starts with a quote. And one of my favorite quotes from when I was a kid was a partial quote from Rudyard Kipling, if you can keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs. And I love that because it speaks to being that calm uh, individual who assesses a situation and makes the best possible decisions in response to whatever it is, rather than someone who goes off half crazy and loses their self control, because then you've lost your ability to be as effective as you otherwise would be. So, yeah, I think so that don't get your way is you know don't get caught up in these petty little squabbles. Instead, get your way. The reference I made earlier. Okay, Koresh reneged on coming out as he promised. Don't browbeat him and make some counter move to punish him. Use it in a more persuasive way to get back on achieving your goal.
We all kinda have, see things from our perspective, and I think even showing up into some of these situations and making assumptions, and this is how it's gonna go, and then, just that a bit of openness, and I would imagine someone in your role too, and I have to do this in my work. It's like you've got to manage your own expectations, and just because you've been in a situation that smelled a little bit similar doesn't mean all the variables are the same. Doesn't mean it's gonna have
That's
the same
right. I
outcome or the
mean,
same timetable.
and it's a very good point, Derek. I mean, the only thing you can really control is yourself. You can enhance your ability to create a relationship where you can influence a person if you keep your self control, but it doesn't guarantee it. You don't know what else is going on behind the screen. What else is motivating this individual? What troubles do they have? What's their personal life? I mean, it's pretty rare that we have that much information on somebody. The longer the situation, the more we gather that, and the whole thing is about self control. I mean, it's just the best negotiators are those people who can control their emotions. I'm not saying we don't feel emotions, and we just don't overreact. I used to tell audiences, it's like, if you're walking down the street with your best friend who's a trauma surgeon, and a terrible, horrendous car wreck occurs right in front of you, and you walk up to the car and somebody's legs have been cut off, how you might react versus your trauma surgeon buddy are probably vastly different. You're both shocked by what you see, but that person's training and preparation help them focus on doing what needs to be done right now to try to save this person. And that's kind of what a good negotiator does. I'm going to put my emotions in the back drawer for right now. I'll maybe pull them out later on, but right now I've got things to do and people to help and lives to save. And you need to be able to do that to respond effectively. Going back to the profiler thing, and I can apologize for skipping over that before. What the profilers, after Silence of the Lambs, the profiling program in the FBI got blown way out of proportion. When television shows that these people can sit there with like Johnny Carson and his genie hat on, and he says the answer is so and so. It's not like that at all. It's basically criminal investigative analysis. They look at probabilities and likelihoods and so forth. Their role in a crisis negotiation situation is a bit limited. They're advisors to the negotiation team. For example, if I or my negotiators are talking to Derek, at the same time I want a profiler listening. I don't want them on the phone negotiating. I want them objectively looking at the interaction we're having, but I also particularly want them to focus on what do you think makes Derek tick? I want to make sure I'm getting your unfettered, independent assessment of what do you think he's trying to accomplish here? What's his primary motivation? What's the hook, as we say, that might convince him not to harm his daughter in there, whatever the situation might be. And then I, as the negotiation coordinator, may or may not use what they say. That's my call. And I think even back then, some FBI commanders even were confused at who does what versus the other. I mean, so the profilers have a very important and a great role in a hostage negotiation situation. It's more, in my opinion, and perhaps I'm biased on this, but it's more of a supportive adjunct role. And police departments are more likely to use if it's a large department, they'll use a department psychologist, or if they've retained an outside psychologist. I always say before you use somebody, make sure they get trained and know what we do as negotiators, and then yeah, fine to bring them on the team and to be used in the manner that I suggested. But don't say, oh, this guy's got a bunch of degrees on the wall. Let's put him on the phone because you know dealing with somebody in a clinical setting is quite different from dealing when somebody's got a gun to somebody's head. And I would rather rely on this old grizzled negotiator that's done 100 of these things successfully than putting Mr. Degree on the phone. I'm not saying psychologists are incapable of doing this well, but it's not the role that they should be playing.
No, that makes a lot of sense for consulting advisory, and you match that with a
Yeah.
negotiator's experience. I know you also did international work as well. I think you even left Waco to have to go out of the country or something from what I
Yeah,
recall.
when they relieved me at Waco, part of the excuse they used, they really wanted to replace me, but part of the excuse was I had to go to the Middle East for something. Could have been probably canceled or postponed, but I went over there, and then I came back, and I was told I'd either go back to Waco or there was a prison riot in Lucasville. So as it ended up, they put in the tear gas, and I was in the FBI headquarters command post when that happened, and then the next day flew to the Lucasville prison riot. So kind of busy times for the Nesner household.
Were there any negotiation tactics that didn't travel well? When you think about international, contextual, like cultural, I don't know if you're going through a translator, there's just a lot of barriers I would imagine with international.
Translation is a challenge. There's also it's about I mean, if it's a kidnap situation, you're not spending a lot of time in direct communications. You're getting a demand and a brief conversation, then they call the next time you have a response for them. So you have a little time to craft out a response. But and I've been involved in several situations with ongoing interpreters, and you actually need two interpreters. I mean, while you and the negotiator are talking, I need somebody to tell me what you're saying in that language, so that I can coach my negotiator. Here's how I think we should respond. I don't have to wait for the negotiator to turn around and tell me what was just said. The other thing I like to use two interpreters because you know, for those of us that don't speak a lot of languages, we think interpreting is quite an easy thing, but we want to make sure that the interpreter is just an instrument to relay to the best of their ability what we're saying, not to add into it. Better listen to this guy. His people are really serious. I don't want editorial commentary. I just want to the best of your ability to relay the words. So those are some challenges we face overseas. There's a lot of cultural things about what I found in a lot of countries. Negotiators, they'll train negotiators, and the negotiators are at, what we consider an appropriate level, which would, mid management or something like that. But they'll get all this training, they'll embrace the concepts, but then they get in a crisis, and the big leaders make a decision anyway, based on zero training. And there was one country that a major country in overseas that we trained numerous times, and they wanted some more training. I said, we can't expend the resources anymore. I said, you're all learning this stuff. You're saying you follow it, but every time you have a situation, you don't get used. And the commander comes in, and culturally, they can't say, or even the FBI, if I was like a colonel and my boss was a general, I could say, "Boss, we shouldn't do that. That's not good." They can't do that in some cultures. You just don't. The boss says, "We're doing this," and everybody goes, "Yes," we're going to do it, and that's a real impediment they have in their systems.
I'm a huge Carl Rogers fan, and you talked about active listening and just the seeing people in that light. I believe at my core is universal.
And there are people who are cross cultural experts, and my view is it's impossible for a negotiator or a negotiation team, even if you have some linguists on your team, to understand all the cultures there are in the world, and to understand it at a depth that would give you, the ability to really understand each little nuance. Well, what we focus on in negotiations is the universality of emotions. Everybody feels love, hate, disappointment, confusion. Everybody. I had a situation once where somebody said, "Well, it's different over here. Family is very important in this country." And I said, "Well, that's great. Could you name a country for me where family's not important? Because I've never seen one." These are universal concepts that present the area where we should devote most of our time and energy. You know, the stuff about, don't greet somebody this way and turn your hand this way. Don't put your foot up there. I mean, okay, that's all good stuff, but there's no sense in trying to overthink that or outmaneuver somebody on that. Just stick with those core things of what's important to people. I mean, I worked a lot of terrorism cases back in the '80s, and everybody said, "Oh, you really got to understand, the culture and the political ideology." And my experience was that most of the terrorists knew less about about their faith than I did. Knew less about the politics than I did. They're just people recruited from the refugee camps, Palestinian terrorists or whatever, to go do a mission without a clear sense of why or who. It's not that complicated. So you can sit there and talk to them about the righteousness or the wrongness of their cause, and you know they could care less.
Over the 30 years, I'm sure there's been reflecting and different things. What do you feel like you're most proud of when you think about your career and how you went about it?
I'm I mean, I was very proud to be an FBI agent. It's something I'd wanted to do since I was a kid, and I still hold the organization in high regard. It's certainly going through some challenges today with its leadership and some of the politicization of it, but I still think its members are really terrific people working very hard on behalf of the American people, and they have a very important, complex job to do. And I was very proud to have played a role in that. I'm really happy that I helped spearhead the negotiation. I went back to the FBI Academy last year, and they told me, you probably don't know this, but every FBI agent now gets training in active listening skills, and that came from you know our negotiation program. That's what we were the forefront of that in the FBI. So I'm kind of proud to have. I mean, I didn't invent active listening skills. I'm not trying to say that whatsoever, but recognizing it as having great applicability to what we do, and then making it the centerpiece of what we instructed. I'm very proud of that accomplishment from myself and my unit. I think we had a big impact, and we helped a lot of police officers and stay alive, and a lot of hostages stay alive, not only in the United States but abroad. And you can feel pretty good about that. You don't win them all, but our success rate was significant. Quite high.
The idea and the misconception that, if someone is in a hostage type situation, like, it's easy to assume that they have something very specific that they want.
I mentioned I became a full-time negotiator in 1990, and Fred Lansley, my mentor, and I were teaching an advanced negotiation school on the West Coast. And these were all supposed to be experienced police negotiators. And um, we defined what a hostage situation was. Someone held in order to compel another to fulfill a demand, threat of serious injury or death. And we described that and said, how many had negotiator situation just like that? And no hands went up. We're going like, what? And then of course we described, the more emotional oriented situation. Of course, everybody, that's their bread and butter, suicides and angry husbands, and you name it. And and to me, it was a bit of an epiphany. Then I realized we were really focusing in the wrong direction. We were still teaching at that time essentially bargaining skills. Well, when you show up at a trailer park and the guy's about to murder his girlfriend because she's threatening to leave, he's not there to get money or a getaway car or have his brother released from jail. I mean, he's there expressing his anger and frustration, and that's quite different. We sort of put things on a continuum from instrumental behavior, which we would say was more in the bargaining realm, or an expressive behavior, which is crisis. And we found that the techniques kind of are universal for both, but most of what we do is dealing with people in states of high emotion, anger, frustration. There's a sense of loss of job, loss of career, loss of relationship, loss of self-esteem, and we have to intervene. A lot of these are homicides followed by suicides, and they don't all end well despite our best negotiation efforts. But these are the things we kind of trying to determine: why is this person here? What do they hope to gain from this? And if we ask ourselves that question, it begins to illuminate for us maybe a path best to approach in order to help diffuse this situation. You mentioned it earlier. People get in these situations, they have a bit of tunnel vision. It's either I get this or I die. There's no turning back. In reality, we have to expand that perspective and give them some sense of hope and help is here, and it's not the end of the world. And that can be tough sometimes because for some people there is no turning back. But mostly, here's a good way to look at it. Derek, you think of somebody on a bridge about to jump. Why haven't they done it yet? Well, because they have some ambivalence, which is the proverbial salesman foot in the door. Part of them wants to live and part of them wants to die. Now, there are a certain percentage. If you go to enough suicides, bridge jumpers, whatever, every once in a while, somebody's going to do it. But the fact that they're hesitating gives us an opportunity to try to interrupt that process and give them hope that there's help for them right now. And we don't say, forget about your problems. We just try to forestall them and get their cooperation. So that's kind of why we try to find out what brought us here today, what's going on. You know, and again, a lot of times police are responding to situations, they don't have this information. They have to get it through the communication process. I mean, you look at the Montana Freeman incident, we had briefing books. We prepared for this. We knew who we were going to be up against. We did backgrounds, who are their family members, what's this person's criminal record, their mental health record. Well, normally police officers on the street don't have any of that. If the situation lasts long enough, they may collect some of it, but it's always going to be less complete picture than we would like.
Well, and seeing that ambivalence is something to be curious about and as opportunities to explore in
Yeah.
conversation.
You would say something like, Mary, you're talking about jumping off that bridge, but there's part of me that thinks you want to keep going on and work through this, and I want to help you if I can. Again, it's not what they expect from police, but it may be an effort to get them to talk about a problem or issue. A lot of the problem people we deal with, uh, they feel as though nobody's listened to them, nobody understands them. Um, we call it the double whammy in life, and you might be interested in this because for most of us, if we have trouble at work, difficult situation with a boss or a coworker, we can go home and sit down with our spouse, our loved one, and complain about the day and talk about the challenges we're facing and get support and comfort. Conversely, if we're having a bad time at home, a lot of us are fortunate enough to have good, trusting colleagues that we can lean on for their thoughts, their help, their ideas. The people we deal with don't have either one of those things, and to get heard, they act out. It's a way of getting attention and seeking help. So we need to keep that in mind. And this is true for anybody in normal situations. It's give people an opportunity to talk about what it is that's troubling them. It's basically what we say. It's uh, a reflection of feelings and a restatement of content. So when I'm responding to you, I'm feeding back what you're telling me in terms of what happened, but also how you feel about it. And when we encourage people to talk about that, for some of them, it's the first time they've done a little self-analysis about what really is driving them crazy, and then they begin to look at you as helpful and non-threatening. Some people view it as manipulation. I don't. I think it's straightforward, empathic intervention that is best served when it's sincere and genuine.
And you think of even like the child psychology is what this reminds me of. It's like
Yep,
behavior is a language of somebody who doesn't feel like they have a voice.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I always tell a humorous story when I'm teaching classes. When my son was very young, and we get to the grocery store to pick up something before dinner, and he wants the candy that the supermarkets conveniently put at child level.
At eye level,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. So, and I said, no, no, no candy. Your mom will kill me, whatever. And I may be the boss at work, but I'm scared at home. So, no, anyway, so I tell him no, and he begins to pitch a bit of a fit. Now I'm embarrassed because there's people in line. I don't like my kids misbehaving, certainly not in public. So I give him the candy, and so I later reflected and I said, what did I just teach him? How to get candy by misbehaving and creating a fit. And it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. He turned out okay, became a Navy SEAL, but these are little lessons you think about. And people do act out when they want to be heard and they want something, they feel nobody's listening, you're giving them what they want. The children do this all the time, and they're masters at it. Um, and that's why they're so difficult and challenging to deal with. I used to joke a lot. I said, none of these skills work at home. They actually do, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but you have to put a
Very, very
you have to
different.
put a
Yeah.
parenthesis on it. Some cases.
Well, Gary, I know we talked about stalling for time. What are you up to these days? Give any kind of plug to your work, and I'm gonna put everything in the show notes for the listeners, but share a little bit about what you're up to now.
Thanks. Well, I'm mostly an old retired guy, but I still I go overseas a couple times a year, and in some of the states I do some negotiation workshops, and I give corporate keynote addresses. I don't do a lot of either anymore, but a lot of podcasts. I'm working on another book. Occasionally, I'll write an article, and my website is it's got all that stuff on it. www.GaryNesner, all one word, .com. If people want to see things I've written or get links to podcasts or shows or whatever interviews. So that's about it. The book is still doing quite well. It's just 15 years ago today it came out. Excuse me, 15 years ago last week, and it's been a real interesting journey. I enjoyed writing it, and it's gotten a lot of good acclaim and been the basis for a lot of follow-on work stuff. So it was a good experience. People kept telling me to write a book, and I was retired for 5 years from the FBI before I finally said, "Okay, let me give this a shot," and it worked out okay.
If I can give a plug to your book, for the listeners, we touched on a couple stories today, but just how in depth Gary goes at those different stories was really insightful, really helpful. I think gives a lot of practical tools why active listening is worth considering in your work and in your relationships and in your business and leadership. We have a lot of listeners in the mental health space, but then also leadership space. Like there's just a lot of practical use cases of and just the evolution of that at the FBI levels was really fascinating from my standpoint. So
Thanks, Derek. No, I mean, it's my view that all of life is a negotiation. I mean, we're communal animals, and we depend on each other for literally everything we do, and therefore we have to find ways to cooperate and work together. And so you could say all of that falls under the category of negotiations. So I think it's sad that sometimes we don't pay enough attention in listening to what others have to say and acknowledging their point of view. And we all should work harder on that, I suppose.